They will never tell you this part in history class because once you hear it, you can't unhear it, and once you see it, you begin to recognize the pattern everywhere. In January of 1854, a baby was born screaming into the cold Virginia air, and 3 men standing outside the door went silent, not from joy, but from terror, because when the doctor lifted the child's hand, he saw 6 fingers perfectly formed, alive, undeniable, not a deformity.
A signature.
A confession written in flesh. That extra finger marked the end of a lie that had been carefully engineered by wealth, fear, and inheritance. It marked the moment a secret arrangement so unnatural that society refused to acknowledge it could no longer hide in the shadows. And the woman who bore that child. She was pale as bone, eyes washed of color, her body purchased like machinery. An albino slave girl, sold for more than most men earned in years, bought not for labor but for blood. Understand this. The institution wasn't broken. It was optimized. Wealthy families didn't just control land and bodies, they engineered outcomes. They bent law, morality, and biology itself to preserve power. And when tradition wasn't enough, they created loopholes no one dared speak about. The Rutland plantation stood like a cathedral to ownership columns gleaming. Roots deep, history rewritten as respectability. 3 brothers inherited it together. But their father had left a condition, not a suggestion, a command from beyond the grave. 1 heir, 1 bloodline, 1 union, singular in law, monstrous in practice. This is where the lie begins. Because when men fear loss, they justify anything. And when power trembles, it seeks control in the most intimate places. Marriage became a mechanism. A woman became a vessel. And biology became the battlefield where greed and legacy fought their war. The albino girl never consented. Consent is a luxury preserved for those who own themselves. She was chosen because she was rare, exotic, because her difference could be explained away as novelty, until it couldn't. That 6th finger was not just genetic chance. It was evidence of desperation, of overlapping claims, of 3 men trying to force eternity into compliance. And here's the truth most people never grasp. This story was not an aberration. It was a prototype, a rehearsal of how institutions disguise coercion as order, how systems convince themselves that survival justifies corruption. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is anatomy, because this same logic, this same willingness to rewrite morality to protect power has never disappeared. It has only learned how to dress better. The plan was never spoken aloud at first. It formed the way all corrupt ideas do, slowly, in glances, in silence heavy enough to feel like agreement. 3 brothers sitting in a study as daylight died across the walls, each of them realizing the same thing. Law only mattered when it served them. Their father had understood something brutal about power. Property fragments when brothers marry separately. Loyalty dissolves once heirs pull in different directions. So he designed a lock marriage as a binding mechanism, lineage as leverage, inheritance as a loaded weapon pointed at his own sons. Obey or be erased. The woman they needed could not be a woman with family, voice, or future. She could not be someone who could refuse or speak or retaliate. She had to exist outside protection, outside sympathy, outside memory. That is how institutions choose their sacrifices. So they searched where choices are sold. In New Orleans, the auction houses specialized not just in labor, but in anomaly. Pale skin, light eyes, bodies that drew whispers. The albino girl stood under the sun like something unfinished by creation. Too white for safety, too rare for mercy. Her appearance made her valuable and disposable. For $1,000 exchanged hands. Papers signed, ownership transferred, and just like that, a human being became a strategy. She was brought north under the cover of necessity, not desire. The story given to neighbors was simple. A personal attendant, a curiosity, an indulgence. Respectability always demands a mask, especially when it intends violence. The arrangement was explained to her only after the doors were shut. 1 brother would be her husband-in-law. The others would arrive when they chose. Silence would be expected. Compliance would be rewarded with survival. Resistance would be corrected. This was not about pleasure. This was about control, about manufacturing an heir without dividing a throne. About turning a woman's body into neutral ground where three claims could overlap without open war. And here is the part most men don't want to admit. The system wasn't just slavery. It was engineering. Every detail mattered: her isolation, her dependency, her confusion. Even her albinism mattered, because if the child was marked as different, society could be persuaded that anything strange was natural, rather than incriminating. They convinced themselves this was temporary, that once an heir was produced, the problem would solve itself. Men always believe corruption has an endpoint where they get to remain intact. But power never stops feeding once it tastes blood. Inside that house, identity began to fracture. The brothers stopped seeing themselves as individuals and started thinking like a committee. Responsibility diffused. Guilt diluted. Evil works best when no single man feels fully responsible. And the girl whose name never properly survived became the quiet center of a system designed to consume her and call it inheritance. Time inside the house moved differently for her. Days were measured not by sunlight or seasons, but by footsteps in the hallway by which brother arrived, by the sound of which key turned in the door. The brothers had rules, of course. Men who commit atrocities always write rules to convince themselves they are not animals. Samuel insisted on order, scheduled visits, predictability, control. He framed it as dignity, as if structure made exploitation cleaner. Thomas handled the details: medicine, diet, timing, tracking the rhythms of her body like a ledger. William prayed before and after, whispering scripture as if God himself had authored the arrangement. Faith used not as a shield for the weak, but as anesthesia for conscience. This was the true inheritance their father left them. Not land, not money, permission. Permission to trespass moral boundaries in the name of continuity. Permission to reduce a human being into a function and still call themselves respectable men. And slowly something changed. The girl's body became quieter. Not obedient, empty. That is what prolonged captivity does. It doesn't just break resistance. It erases expectation. Survival shrinks until it fits inside the next hour. Hope becomes inefficient. Memory becomes pain. What terrified the brothers wasn't her silence, it was her unpredictability. Because biology refuses contracts. No matter how precisely men plan, life has its own arithmetic. Each month without pregnancy tightened the pressure. 3 years. That was the clock ticking inside the walls. Arguments escalated. Accusations hissed through clenched teeth. Each brother suspected the others of dominance, of trying to ensure the child would be theirs in ways that could never be proven. You see, even in cooperation, men still compete. Control breeds paranoia. They adjusted tactics. Frequency increased. More supervision. More intrusion. What began as a theoretical arrangement became an obsession. And the woman caught at the intersection of desperation and fear absorbed all of it. Then the signs appeared. Nausea. Fatigue. Subtle swelling. When Thomas confirmed it, relief didn't fill the room. Suspicion did. Because pregnancy solved one problem but created another. Proof. Now a child would arrive carrying evidence. Features. Traits. Something that might betray the truth they'd buried beneath paperwork and prayer. They told themselves it would be fine. Genetics were mysterious, they said. Albino bodies were unusual anyway. Differences could be dismissed. Midwives could be bribed. Doctors silenced. Records altered. Institutions protect those who feed them. But beneath those rationalizations lay a deeper fear, one none of them spoke, but all of them felt. What if the child revealed everything? What if the body remembered what the law tried to forget? Because no system, no matter how well insulated, can fully erase the fact of trespass. Nature keeps receipts. And when the contractions began on a frozen January morning, 3 men waited outside the room, not as fathers but as defendants awaiting a verdict written in blood and bone. They still believed power could save them. They were wrong. The room smelled of boiled water, iron, and fear. The midwife had done this 100 times before, but never like this. Not with 3 men pacing just beyond the door, their boots wearing grooves into the floorboards, their silence louder than shouting. The woman on the bed did not scream the way others did. She endured, jaw clenched, eyes unfocused, as if pain were simply another command she had learned to obey. When the child finally emerged, he arrived strong. Too strong. Lungs full of fire. A cry that cut through the house like accusation. For a moment, relief almost won.
Asson.
An heir. The answer to 3 years of calculation and controlled violence. Then the doctor looked closer. Hands are instinctive. They are the first thing men check: strength, symmetry, normalcy. And when the right hand opened, the room shifted. 6 fingers. Each one formed with intention. Each joint moving as if to say, "I belong here." The doctor froze. Not out of superstition but recognition. This was not chance. This was not injury. This was overlap. Biology colliding where it was never meant to be shared. Outside, the brothers knew before they were told. Men who build secrets develop a sixth sense for collapse. When the door opened, no one smiled. No one asked questions. They stared at that small, impossible hand like condemned men stare at the scaffold. Because the child had spoken without words. 6 fingers meant too much access. Too many claims. A body that refused to choose one father. The proof of trespass written openly where concealment was impossible. This was not just scandal, it was evidence that could not be argued away with money or status. And suddenly the albino girl was no longer useful. Institutions are loyal only while you are profitable. The moment you become a liability, protection evaporates. Doctors begin to remember oaths. Neighbors begin to notice patterns. Rumors, once dismissed, start aligning. They debated quietly that night. What could be hidden? What could be destroyed? What could be rebranded as divine mystery or genetic anomaly? But somewhere deep down, each brother understood the truth they spent years avoiding. The system they trusted had limits. Power can coerce consent, cannot command nature. The child survived. Strong, healthy, observant. His extra finger became both shield and weapon, drawing attention no money could fully suppress. Whispers leaked into Richmond. Lawyers stalled. Clergy hesitated. Questions multiplied. And the woman? She lived just long enough to realize something cruel and clarifying. Her body had outlived its purpose, but her child had not. That meant the world would keep him, even if it erased her. What the brothers failed to understand was this. When corruption reproduces itself, it doesn't create heirs. It creates witnesses. This is the moment where stories usually retreat into footnotes. Where records blur. Where families close ranks and blame dissolves into time. But this story didn't end cleanly because corruption never does. It metastasizes. After the birth, the house changed. Doors stayed locked longer. Voices lowered. Servants were dismissed, replaced, warned. The brothers stopped sleeping. Samuel drank. Thomas rewrote accounts late into the night. William prayed harder than ever. Not for forgiveness but for erasure. He wanted the past to dissolve under faith the way blood dissolves in water. But something had shifted, and everyone felt it. The child's hand became a symbol people couldn't unsee. 6 fingers don't stay secret in a world obsessed with lineage. Every glance carried questions. Every visit felt like inspection. They tried to control who saw him, how often, under what light. Control the narrative. Shape the silence. That's how institutions work. They don't deny truth, they manage exposure. And now listen carefully, because this is where this story stops being about them and starts being about you. Halfway through revelations like this, most men instinctively pull back. Not because they doubt the story, but because they recognize the pattern. They sense how often power demands silence in exchange for safety. How often systems reward compliance and punish curiosity. So I'm going to ask you to do something simple. Comment this phrase twice, exactly as I say it, if you're still willing to keep going. I see the pattern. I see the pattern. Not for superstition. For ownership. For marking the moment you decided not to look away. Because what happened next reveals the mechanism beneath countless forgotten atrocities. The brothers debated the unthinkable, not what was right, but what was survivable. Could the child be sent away, reclassified, hidden under medical explanation? They consulted lawyers, doctors, clergymen, men who spoke softly and charged richly to protect reputations. And one by one, each institution hesitated. Not refused, hesitated. Because even systems designed to protect power have limits when evidence becomes too visible. When a body itself contradicts the story, the plantation began to bleed value. Credit tightened. Neighbors withdrew. What had been whispered as envy now carried certainty. The very mechanism meant to preserve the family had instead exposed its decay. And that's the law. Power never escapes. When control becomes too total, it reveals itself. The extra finger wasn't the problem. It was the proof. Once the pattern was visible, it couldn't be unseen, not by the town, not by the institutions that had quietly enabled them, and certainly not by the brothers themselves. The land still stood. The house still gleamed in daylight. But something essential was gone. Authority depends on credibility, and credibility had been quietly poisoned. Visitors stopped coming unannounced. Creditors began asking questions that required written answers. The lawyer who had once spoken with certainty now spoke with caution, rehearsing every word as if already imagining testimony. Even the church, that old partner of preservation, repositioned itself. Scripture was still quoted, but now it was used to distance, not to defend. This is how systems abandon you. Not with punishment, but with absence. The brothers turned inward. Cooperation fractured into blame. Samuel argued they should never have trusted secrecy over legality. Thomas insisted the math had been sound, that probability had simply betrayed them. William claimed it was God's judgment, but judgment always sounds convincing when it arrives too late to change anything. And the child grew. 6 fingers became 6 reminders present at every meal, every walk, every unwanted stare. He wasn't sickly. He wasn't cursed. He was intelligent, observant, inconvenient. A living contradiction to the story they needed the world to believe. The albino mother faded from the house in the way women like her always did, quietly, without ceremony. Whether through illness, removal, or exhaustion was never properly recorded. History preserves outcomes, not costs. But the child remained. Too visible to kill. Too unusual to integrate. Too legitimate to disown without questions. He existed in that dangerous space where truth refuses to be harvested cleanly. Eventually, the clause triggered itself. Legal challenges arose, first subtle, then explicit. The inheritance clause that had once protected the estate was now examined under scrutiny it had never expected. The brothers' unity, already eroded, proved insufficient. Assets locked. Sales forced. The great plantation fractured anyway, not by marriage, but by exposure. This is the hidden rule elites never speak aloud. Power survives predation but not revelation. The child did not need to accuse anyone. His body had already testified. His existence made lies expensive. And when lies become expensive, systems recalculate loyalty. By the time the estate was broken apart, the story had already been buried under euphemism and discretion. But enough men knew. Enough whispers survived. Enough silence became suspicious. And that is why this story still matters. Because the mechanisms that trapped that woman, that turned a child into evidence, that convinced institutions to look away, they never disappeared. They just refined themselves. Different laws, same leverage, different language, same control. And once you understand that, you stop asking why history feels unfinished. It is. What remains after power collapses isn't justice. It's residue. Fragments of truth embedded in rumor, legal phrasing, and family shame. The world doesn't correct corruption, it archives it, strips it of names, and pretends the lesson expired with the people. The brothers dispersed. Not together. Power binds men until it doesn't, then it scatters them. Samuel left Virginia with what money he could salvage, chasing relevance in cities that didn't know his history. Thomas disappeared into clerical work, a man who once calculated bodies now counting other people's assets. William stayed near the church, hiding behind scripture that no longer required belief, only obedience. The child was relocated. records adjusted, a different surname, a small stipend arranged on the condition of distance and silence. Not kindness containment. You don't erase witnesses. You manage them. He grew up knowing something was wrong but never being told what it was. That is the final cruelty of control confusion. When people can't name their trauma, they blame themselves. Institutions understand this better than any tyrant ever did. And the broader system learned too. From that scandal came refinement. Fewer shared arrangements. Better legal insulation. More plausible deniability. Because the goal was never morality, it was continuity. Power doesn't abandon immoral strategies. It optimizes them. Now listen carefully, because this is the thread that connects then to now. Men like to believe horrors end when laws change. But laws are updated manuals, not moral revolutions. The same instincts that drove three brothers to convert a human being into a solution still operate through contracts, incentives, cultural pressures, psychological leverage. Control no longer wears chains. It wears paperwork, reputations, algorithms, social dependency. But the function is identical. Reduce resistance, manufacture compliance, preserve hierarchy. That albino woman wasn't erased because she was weak. She was erased because she revealed the cost of comfort. The child wasn't a scandal because of extra fingers. He was a scandal because he exposed cooperation where competition was supposed to hide sins. And here is the part that should unsettle you most. You don't need plantation houses for this structure to exist. You need fear of loss. You need silence. You need men willing to trade conscience for security. History is not warning you. It is describing you. Most men dismiss these stories as grotesque relics. But relics don't recur this cleanly. Patterns do. And the moment you recognize the pattern, you face a choice the brothers never made. To participate, or to see clearly. Here's the truth they never teach because it doesn't flatter civilization. The world you live in was not healed, it was renovated. Nothing about human hunger for control has changed since that winter in Virginia. It has only learned better camouflage. The plantation became the corporation. The inheritance clause became the contract. The albino girl became any person rendered powerless enough to be necessary. The six-fingered child became data and anomaly flagged, explained away, and quietly archived. And the same deal is still offered. Comfort in exchange for silence. The brothers weren't monsters because they were uniquely evil. They were monsters because they were ordinary men placed inside a system that rewarded obedience to legacy over conscience. That is why this story matters. Not because it's shocking, but because it's familiar. Every era produces men who tell themselves they had no choice. Every era proves them wrong. The most dangerous lies are not whispered in secret societies. They are written into procedures. They sound reasonable, responsible, temporary, until someone's body, mind, or future is used up to make the math work. The albino woman did not die unknown because history forgot her. She was removed because her existence disrupted the narrative. And the child marked by nature itself outlived the men who tried to use him as proof of dominance. Power rarely produces heirs fit to rule. It produces evidence that something is rotten beneath the ceremony. So if you've stayed to the end, understand this: awareness is not passive. Knowing the pattern asks something of you. It demands that when systems pressure you to comply quietly, to look away, to accept that's how it works. You hear the echo of that child's cry in the background of progress. This knowledge isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to harden you. Because once a man sees how power really preserves itself, he stops mistaking authority for legitimacy. He stops assuming institutions have his interests at heart. He learns to ask who benefits, who is silenced, and who is being consumed to make the story hold. Most people will forget this story the moment the screen goes dark. They will feel disturbed, then relieved, then distracted. But some of you won't. And those men no longer move through the world asleep. They move informed, uncomfortable, untouchable. That is why this knowledge was buried, and why you were never meant to hear it. If the story unsettled you, it was supposed to. Most people consume darkness like entertainment. But the men who recognize patterns don't just watch, they transform. If you're still here, comment this twice below. I see the pattern. I see the pattern. Then subscribe, not for stories, but for awareness most men are never given. Because once you understand how power really preserves itself, you stop being usable. And that's exactly why this knowledge was buried.